I often describe the property market of an individual town or city, Bushy, as like one big jigsaw puzzle. And there's numerous pieces to the puzzle, and we need to know what those pieces are, where to get them. We need to put them together and then see what the picture looks like.
Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how and where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You'll hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested. Hi, freedom fighters. Is now a good time to invest in property? And if so, how are you going to go about it? What don't you do? And what do you do? And how do you get started? You'll be happy to know that you've arrived at exactly the right episode to answer all of these questions. Because today, we continue our focus on the future for property in Australia for a very good reason. We're on the verge of a property boom. And rarely do I get this excited, but I'm getting ahead of myself. If you haven't listened to last week's episode with Pete Wargent, who gave a great overview of what's likely to happen globally and locally from the economy to share markets and property, then have a listen to this now as it sets the scene for this week where we dig deeper into property with leading national residential property market analyst and Get Invested regular, Simon Pressley. Simon is one of Australia's leading property market analysts and he's the head of national buyers agency Propertyology. Simon continuously analyses forward-looking property fundamentals in every market every day, covering every city and every non-capital city across Australia, to help everyday Aussies to invest in strategically chosen locations right across the nation. Have a listen to his full background on Get Invested episode 117 if you haven't done so already. So why am I so excited? Because at the time of this episode, we're in the eye of a property storm with property values for A-class properties in high demand constrained supply locations set to enjoy strong, consistent growth in the very near future. Why? Because we're currently in a very rare window of opportunity. A window of opportunity where all of the property value growth drivers are aligning. And we still have a significant housing shortage in Australia, and COVID has acted as an accelerator that has created pent-up demand, limited supply, billions of nation-building infrastructure projects have been brought forward. We've got historic low interest rates, a relaxation of borrowing laws in the near future that's going to bolster purchase price ability and capacity, that will in turn increase demand and price pressure, and a strong potential population explosion from both COVID babies along with a flood of skilled migrants once international borders are reopened. All this bolstered by a raft of integrated stimulus measures and support packages at all levels of government. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity, so those that act now before prices really start to escalate will enjoy the benefits, and those that sit on the sidelines will kick themselves in a couple of years for waiting. Excuse me. Now, when someone asks me, when's the best time to invest in property, I always respond, every time you can. And if you can, that means now. Why? Because the TLC of time, leverage and compounding returns are the keys to building wealth with property. And time, being the time you hold a property, is the most critical of these. Now, I can hear you getting excited. I can hear you saying, okay, I get it. Let's just do it. I'll race out now and buy a property nearby, right? So you jump on realestate.com.au or realty.com.au or domain, and you start looking at properties, and you start spending your weekends driving around nearby suburbs looking for nice properties in nice areas that you'd like to live in, where prices have already been increasing steadily, or you find the so-called hotspots and try and buy the cheapest property you can get your hands on in those areas, right? That's the sound of the wrong answer buzzer on the game show. Most investors think like homeowners, and they look for a pretty house in an area that is in drivable distance in their backyard. Then they make sure it's in a pretty street, in a pretty suburb, that is close to pretty shops, pretty schools, and pretty facilities. Many first-time investors will spend their Saturdays scanning the real estate section of the weekend paper or checking real estate websites for potential properties. They then spend hours driving around to opens looking for property and talking to real estate agents and worrying about whether they would live in the property and debating the colour of the feature walls and the shape of the tap handles. And once they purchase a property, they race off to the bank to get a loan. And when the property settles, they then advertise for a tenant themselves because they think they can do it better and cheaper. And at the end of the year, they go along to their tax account with a bulging manila folder full of property stuff. And then after a couple of years, they're getting highly frustrated from dealing with the maintenance issues and tenant vacancies when they're tired in the evenings and on their rare weekends. Then the mounting costs that they hadn't thought about mean that it all gets too hard and expensive, and they throw their hands up in the air, they sell the property for about what they bought it for, and they vow never to do it again. Does that sound familiar? Unfortunately, this is why over half of the first-time investors in our country sell their investment property within 5 years of buying it. Now, if you put yourself in this situation, you've just bought yourself a second job, and you've put your assets with the highest value and the highest risk in the hands of someone who generally doesn't have the expertise or the time to do the job properly. And that's yourself. I hate to say it, but good luck with that. This is what most first-time investors do. But if you're going to be successful long-term, selecting the investment property is actually the last thing that you do. And this approach is the complete opposite and the reverse of what you need to do if you want to join the ranks of those that enjoy sustainable success in property long-term. Most first-time investors think property investment with the word property in big, bold capitals and the word investment in tiny little italics. But successful investors think the opposite in relation to investment property, with investment in big, bold, flashing capitals, followed by the word property in small, minute subscript. The property is just the means to the investment end. Just think of investment properties as money boxes in the shape of a house, and think with your head based on the numbers, not using your heart driven by emotion. The biggest mistake property investors make is that they get obsessed with the property appearance or the shopping centre or the schools, which are important if you're going to live there, but aren't if you're going to invest, as these things don't make things grow. So the number one thing that property investors need to do is to disregard where you live. Familiarity and comfort breed blindness and bias when it comes to investing. If you're looking to buy a property for investment purposes, your number one objective is financial performance. And the key to giving yourself the best chance of that is to review 100% of your available options. But what does 100% of your options mean? Well, quite simply, there are over 10.5 million properties in Australia, spread across 8 states and territories, across 537 councils, with 15,280 cities, towns, villages and suburbs, congregating around 8 capital cities and just over 200 non-capital cities. Now, Simon suggests that you think of this as a stock exchange for your property investment. When you invest in shares, you're not looking for the biggest company. You're looking for the best performing shares across the 2,100 odd stocks that are available. And because 80% of the growth in property values is driven by the location, you need to start treating your property investment options like it's the property version of the stock market. So you need to consider all of those locations and areas and then go through a process of elimination to drill down to a much smaller number and then consider the individual fundamentals through the lens of your future telescope, not your current microscope. That's how a professional investor selects a stock on the stock exchange, not because they work for the company or they're familiar with a brand name like the Commonwealth Bank or Woolworths. So why do most property investors buy properties in their backyard? They are severely limiting the potential financial performance of their property investment when they do this. Let me give you an example so you can fully realise the significance of this difference on your end results when we look at differences in property growth interest rates or capital growth rates. The often overlooked component of compounding returns is the impact the actual growth rate has on your property investment results. Now, most investors will realise 5% per annum is less than 8% per annum from the investment. But they might think a difference of 3% per annum doesn't sound like a huge amount. However, the cumulative differences to the level of wealth created are absolutely massive. Let's say, for example, that you invested in a property valued at $400,000 and received an average growth rate of 5% per year. This property will be worth just over $1 million in 20 years' time. Now, if a better located and better profile property of the same value performed just a little better, at say 8% capital growth per year, that same initial value property investment will be worth nearly $1.9 million after 20 years. That's a staggering nearly $900,000 difference, or over 75% increase just with a 3% differential in growth. So are you still thinking local? Or are you ready to become a borderless investor and look at the best opportunity, not the nearest available one? Buying a property in your backyard just because it's close and familiar is severely limiting to the financial performance potential of your investment. What you would live in as far as the property in the area is concerned has got very little to do with investment performance. Now, as an example, there are less Australians living in Adelaide than living in Adelaide, and you can say the same for every town and city in the country. It's not important whether I would like to live in a location or that particular house or that particular apartment. This isn't important, so you need to stop thinking with your heart and start thinking with your head as an investor. Which location and which type of property is going to give you the most money over time is the key investment question you need to be asking yourselves. You don't have to like the location, and you don't have to like the type of property personally. It just needs to stack up in terms of financial performance long term. Personal preferences don't count and generally cloud and get in the way of making good financial decisions. You need to remove yourself from the equation here, because if the numbers don't work, you keep looking. To know what sort of property to buy and go about securing the best property for you, commence by reframing your mindset and your outlook. And then you can summarise the where, the what and the how. You need to move from looking through the rear view microscope and shift to your future telescope. As I've talked about in earlier episodes, investing in property means taking a long-term view over the next 10 to 20 years in order to build your wealth so that you can then replace your income. For this, you need to develop a clear vision of the future. You need to be able to transport yourself into the future and imagine how an area and a property is going to look in 1 or 2 decades' time, and not be too distracted by how it looks today. In this regard, you need to look beyond the rearview mirror of past performance. Throw away your myopic microscope that focuses on today's minutiae and strap on your long-range future vision time travel telescope. You need to be able to take a step back so that you can see the forest from the trees. Too often, investors focus just on the past and the present of an individual property, instead of visualising the future of the entire area based on research that confirms committed change and improvement. Successful investors are informed visionaries with a clear picture of the future. In other words, You need to transform yourself from short-sighted Mr. Magoo into the futuristic Elroy Jetson. Now, I might be showing my age a bit here, so if you don't know who they are, have a quick search online if you don't know these characters. Now, on the basis of all of this, a more important question to ask yourself is not when to invest in property, because when is now if you can, but where and what. And this is where Simon's past, present and future property research comes to the rescue. And while past and recent property price performance is not what you need to focus on in relation to finding the best and the highest growth property now for your future, it does teach us some valuable lessons that need to inform our future purchase decisions. Now, Simon has rigorously researched and reviewed residential property price movements using official data over the last 30 years across 550 different council areas right across the country that has revealed and reinforced some key principles and valuable learnings that reiterate the fundamental property principles and processes that I've outlined in my book, The Freedom Formula. The first of these is that property values in an area move in cycles, and each area's cycle acts independently and often out of sync with other areas. In broad terms, property values in a location follow what I call the property S-curve, or the peak and plateau pattern. Property prices generally increase over a few years, and then they plateau over a much longer period before experiencing another growth spurt. And when I mean an area, we're not talking about states or cities or suburbs or even postcodes. We're talking about precincts within these areas that are all experiencing and moving through their growth cycles. One of the major observations from Simon's research is that growth cycles don't happen very often. Over the last 30 years, very few areas have experienced more than 2 growth cycles. For example, Melbourne and Sydney have had 2 booms over that time. There is the odd exception where an area has had 3 booms, but no location around the country has had more than 3. Most have had 2, and a few have only had 1. And for clarification, a growth cycle is a period of years with price growth data confirming out of the ordinary growth rates that normally last between 2 and 5 years. And for more clarification, the average property value capital growth rate per year has been about 6.8% over the last 25 years. And an average growth rate of 7.2% will double the value of your property every 10 years. So Simon's historical review reveals that growth cycles don't happen very often, and when they do, they don't last very long. So if a location has recently had a growth cycle, a price boom, or a big surge in property prices, the odds of it happening again anytime soon are significantly diminished. It would be rewriting history completely for this to occur. Now, we should clarify that after a period of strong growth, it doesn't mean it won't grow at all, but growth is likely to be small and incremental. It's also important to note that a growth cycle can also end in a significant downturn, as was experienced in parts of Sydney when credit was tightened before and after the Banking Royal Commission, and prices actually came back around about 10% during that time temporarily. And property price downturns are normally caused by 2 main things. Firstly, an overzealous construction industry that means there's an excess supply during the property boom that was actually a direct contributor to the Sydney and Melbourne downturns that occurred from 2017 to 2019. Similar things have happened in other parts of Australia during local growth cycles if construction gets too excited and overstimulated that leads to this price downturn. The glut of inner-city apartments are a classic example of this. But normally, when growth cycles end, it normally means several years of not much growth. And you may have some years where property prices are dead flat, amongst years that might see 1% growth one year and 5% the next, followed by minus 2% the year after, which results in an average overall flat market position. Now, this means that it's generally too late to jump in when an area has been growing for a couple of years, as this might be the last year, or at best, there might be 1 or 2 years left, followed by many years of very little growth. This also means that it's better to be too early in the market, to buy a property in an area that hasn't been growing for long periods of time and it's still flat now. as you're likely to be much closer to enjoying the next growth cycle, providing all of the critical growth drivers are becoming evident. But you don't just buy because it's been flat for a long period of time. There has to be strong evidence of future growth. So in addition to growth cycles not occurring very often, the other thing that property history demonstrates is that property values grow for definite reasons. And the key reason is positive change driven by new committed infrastructure and or rezoning that creates good jobs, that puts pressure on property prices, that builds confidence, and this growth spiral commences. So, just look for change, future infrastructure, and follow the jobs. Keep your eye out for committed infrastructure and or rezoning, along with evident employment growth, and ensure that housing supply is constrained or limited so there's an element of scarcity. And make sure that the local demographics are dominated by strong incomes that are growing over time so that locals can continue to afford to pay more for properties that will sustain that property price growth. What causes an area to grow is when a local economy goes from being an underwhelming to a progressively improving area, breathing confidence into the local community, and confidence is something that everyone requires to transact in property because confidence drives the purchase decision. Because before we go out and buy the property asset, the sexy, exciting thing that everyone wants, before we buy it, we've got to have the confidence and the capacity to buy the debt or to borrow the hundreds of thousands required to fund the property purchase. This is what the property buyer does first. You've got to buy the debt. That sometimes fearful and not so sexy bit where people don't buy or borrow the debt without having the necessary confidence to do so. So what you need to look for is a big body of evidence that shows that the local economy in coming years is going to be much better than what it is now. But where can you find this out? Well, government and council records confirming approved infrastructure and rezonings, industry reports, and local media reports are where you need to start. You're looking for confirmation that governments and businesses are going to build and expand their workforce. Once you see a location that's showing lots of positive announcements, then it's worthy of initial attention, but doesn't automatically confirm that this is a good investment location. But it does flag the need to drill down and look for other indicators of supply, demand, and sentiment confidence like vacancy rates, school catchment zones, demographics, etc. Getting in early prior to the growth cycle kicking into full steam also means that you're buying or building in a buyer's market where there are few other buyers and you have greater power over the negotiation in terms of price and timing, etc. So the first thing you start seeing in an area is not price growth, but job creation. Then you see local confidence start to increase. Then you see signs of more property buyers around. Then you start missing out on buying a property because others are paying more. And that then leads to price growth. And this is where the macro to micro scarcity search model that I detail in my book, The Freedom Formula, comes in. When focusing on maximising capital growth, you need to start at the macro level and then progressively work your way down to the micro level, which is the reverse of what most home buyers do. Now, this top-down scarcity method confirms that the actual property is last on this selection list. As I say, this is the reverse of what I see a lot of investors doing, and it's probably one of the main reasons that property investors don't achieve the growth they're expecting, because they only focus on the actual property. Again, successful investors are informed visionaries with a very clear picture of the future. This means you need to develop a future vision to be able to imagine how an area and a property is going to look in 1 to 2 decades' time and not be distracted by how it looks today. You need to visualise the future of the entire area based on research that confirms committed change and improvement from rezoning and infrastructure projects. Remember, 80% of capital growth, or the rise in the property value, comes from the location and only 20% from the property. So when focusing on maximising capital growth, start at the macro level and then progressively work your way down to the micro level where the property is the last thing you look at. In this context, the time-proven 6-step top-down scarcity search model that I document in my book is as follows. Firstly, start with your spend. Confirm what property purchase price you are actually able to afford using, and then engage an investment-savvy mortgage broker to help you with this, so that based on your equity and your borrowing capacity, you can then find the highest growth 3 to 4 bedroom home at that price right across Australia. Then you look at state. So as a starting point, assess the highest capital growth location at your purchase price point and assess the scarcity from population growth, mean house prices, house demand and supply, and committed government housing and infrastructure project spend in that area. Then we need to synchronise. So it's time to look at your purchase in the cyclic motion of the local property S-curve growth cycles that we've already spoken about, from peak to trough. And we're endeavouring to identify areas that are about to go through their once in 10 to 15 year growth phase. Then we get down to suburb level, and we focus on high potential growth suburbs with strong demand and constrained supply, supported by high income growth resident demographics, which is important. I'll come back to this. Ignore recent high or above normal capital growth rates and focus on future change, which is demonstrated via committed nearby infrastructure and or zoning and planning improvements. And suburbs that fall within the catchment area of the best private and public schools, because people will move to get their kids into the best schools. And finally, we get down, or second from final, actually, we get down to the street level. So we want to pinpoint specific attractive amenity precincts by assessing the overall area, street and housing appeal, along with the best proximity to public transport, schools, lifestyle amenities and shopping. And then finally, we get down to what I call the sanctuary, or the actual property level, where we assess the actual property profile for its attractiveness. And this is last. We determine what type and style of property is in highest demand in that area and consider land size and configuration, owner-occupier rates in the area, street appeal, aesthetics in terms of style, materials and finishes, its outlook with views of water, hills or parklands, the floor plan, the age, the condition, accommodation profile, and the potential to manufacture improved value through renovation, subdivision or redevelopment. Also consider rental yield at this point by talking to a really good property manager. Other essential high growth property selection parameters include a focus on real houses for real people. That is, a house on a separate block of land to maximise your capital growth. And concentrate on locations that have a minimum population catchment of at least 80 to 100,000 people so that the workforce is diversified and not reliant on one industry. Demographics are also important to this continued price growth. You need strong, stable incomes that are increasing over time so that property buyers can continue to afford to pay more for property in the location. Otherwise, affordability can put a ceiling on the price growth of the property in those areas. And your final property selection relies on intimate local knowledge of what works and what people are looking for in that particular area, which is why we advocate using a good local buyer's agent in conjunction with a property manager. Again, avoid basing this assessment on what you would personally prefer to live in and focus on the type of property profile in highest local demand in that location. Now, Simon and Propertyology have recently completed an in-depth study of property performances across Australia. So to whet your appetite, here's a sampling of Simon's best performing property locations over the last 5 years, categorised into Tier 1 to Tier 5, with Tier 5 being the lowest capital growth over this period and Tier 1 being the highest property value growth. Now, starting at the bottom and working up, some Tier 5 locations around Australia include Perth, Darwin and Margaret River in WA. Tier 4 are locations where the median house prices increased between 0 and 20% over the last half of a decade. These include Sydney, Gold Coast, Wagga, Adelaide, Wodonga, Brisbane, Dubbo and Cairns. Tier 3 are properties that have increased between 20 to 35%, which include Goulburn, Launceston, Newcastle, Mildura, Melbourne, Burnie, Canberra and Bendigo. You can hear that these are properties in completely different cities and completely different states, with different sizes and different economic profiles. Tier 2 captures areas that have enjoyed between 35 to 50% over that 5 years, and they include Lithgow, Byron, Noosa, Kempsey, the Bass Coast, Kiama, Shoalhaven and Geelong. It also includes the Bega Valley, Coffs Harbour, Griffiths, Ballina, Ballarat, Maitland and Orange. All of these areas have enjoyed between 35 to 50% and have outperformed 7 out of 8 capital cities over that time. And finally, Tier 1. The best performing property locations across the whole nation over the last 5 years include Hobart, the Macedon Ranges, Snowy Monaro and Mitchell, which are local government councils or shires. And notice that only one of these is a capital city. And before you rush off to realestate.com.au or realty.com.au to start looking at properties in these areas, remember that growth cycles only generally last for 2 to 5 years. So you're likely to be too late to enjoy any significant short-term property value growth in the locations we've just mentioned. Again, we need to be focusing on where the future growth is going to occur that's driven by positive change. And it's worth noting that COVID has mixed things up considerably and disrupted the normal pattern as the property buying habits of Australians are shifting from a focus on living close to the city towards a decentralisation and regionalisation where hard-working Aussies are seeking the relative safety, security and space offered by locations that provide good lifestyle amenities while still having the technology infrastructure to allow people to work from home. Now, this paradigm shift is a structural change that's going to create a lot of opportunity for astute property investors who do their homework and capitalise early on these new emerging opportunities. We're living through a significant watershed moment and nothing creates greater opportunity than significant change. So bring it on. Now, I'm not suggesting you just chase the rate of growth because some of these locations have come off a very low price point. So any increase can look impressive in percentage terms. You'll also need to consider the ongoing sustainability of price growth in the area. What do I mean by that? Well, for myself and our know-how property team, we generally don't consider areas that have a local catchment population of under 80 to 100,000, as you need a critical mass and a volume of property transactions coupled with economic diversity across a number of growth industries to ensure this ongoing price growth. Now, in this light, mining towns, for example, are generally a no-no because they're very heavily reliant on the mining industry. We prefer to look at capitals or cities close to the mining area and invest there, as this is where a lot of the workforce tend to live in any case. So, we'd invest in metropolitan Adelaide if the BHP mining works at Olympic Dam and in Roxby Downs were showing strong long-term infrastructure spending growth. But where do you go to get the information that you need to make smart property investment purchase decisions? Let me start by telling you where you don't go. It's not economists that are quoted in the media. Economists are very good at what they do at the macroeconomic level, but they're not property experts. And Simon and I get very frustrated that the media continues to quote them and headline their views on property. Economists aren't property experts. They never have been and they never will be. They're general practitioners. They'll often give an interview in the morning about monetary policy, another at mid-morning on commodity prices, then at lunch they're talking about what's happening on the stock exchange, and then the newspapers will ask them what's likely to happen in property markets. They're generalists, but increasingly the media relies on them for expert comment, which is part of the reason we don't get good quality information through the media. It's like going to a GP expecting them to do an intimate brain surgery. They have a rough idea of what's involved, but certainly wouldn't be able to reliably complete the intimate surgery required for you to be safe and sure of getting the best result. So, are you feeling inspired and motivated to invest in property, but also a little bit overwhelmed and confused on what to do and where to start? Well, while building a successful property portfolio is not rocket science, it's definitely a specialist team sport. It requires a team of proven professionals committed to achieving your goals over many years to make it happen. As with any team, successful or not, your property team is only as good as the weakest player. You only need one weak link for the chain to break. So make sure the weak link isn't you. If you're a time-poor professional with a busy career or a small business owner and an operator, you just don't have the time or expertise to invest in property properly. But surprisingly, this is exactly what a lot of people do. Now, as a closet perfectionist who suffers from the odd dose of OCD, I'm always trying to achieve the best possible results by using the best available people to make it happen. In this regard, I'm not a big believer in DIY. So if I need high-risk brain surgery, I'm not going to Google it and then grab a hacksaw, scalpel, forceps, a needle, thread, and some cotton wool and a bit of metho and have a go at myself in front of the bathroom mirror. The operation may be a success, but the patient's likely to die. If I want an expert job, I engage an expert to do it. Wealth creation through property investment is no different. It's a high-cost and potentially high-risk process if the myriad of complex interrelated actions aren't executed correctly to suit your particular circumstance. So I suggest you engage the best available independent professional property team to protect your interests and to make it happen. And then your only role is to manage your managers. Feel free to reach out to me or our know-how team to start building your knowledge and your confidence, or join me for one of our free live interactive 3-part Zoom information sessions to see if property investment's for you. You can jump on knowhowproperty.com.au/freedom fighters to book in a time that suits you, and I look forward to having a chat to you then personally. Now, these sessions are live and free, they're intimate and interactive. It's all about giving you the inspiration and the information without any pressure so you can decide what, if anything, is the best way forward for you. And once you're clear on your strategy, you can then have a chat to our investment savvy mortgage brokers or another property investment specialist finance broker to confirm your capacity before then engaging someone like Simon and his propertyology team or another properties research house to identify the best locations before you then engage an independent buyer's agent or a property manager if you're building to finally then secure the property. And if you're looking for further support on the positive direction for property in the near future, check out Simon's recent report on his website under his Insights tab. So just jump on propertyology.com.au/property boom before Christmas. It's a really good read. And in today's great motivating discussion with Simon, we answer all of your key questions relating to this that include what impact, if any, will the US election outcome have on property in Australia? What are the facts versus the media fiction on property value movements? Why is the fiscal cliff term an absolute load of BS? And why have so many so-called experts got their property forecasts so grossly wrong? What are the emerging trends that are going to impact on property values moving forward? What impact will the latest rate drop together with the relaxation of lending laws in March have on property? With interest rates at all-time lows and likely to remain there for most of the decade, what impact will this have on property buyer strategies? What current property locations are currently rising or falling? Which buyer demographics are those that are currently most active? Why is 2021 set for the biggest property boom in over 15 years? And if you're ready to invest in property, what, where and why would you invest it now? So get out your notebook and enjoy this highly energising and always informative chat with Simon Pressley. Welcome back, Freedom Fighters. Now, as the blue sky continues to emerge and the sun actually starts to shine through as the local Australian threat of COVID recedes and the much-awaited US elections now behind us, it's a great time to check in and see what really lies ahead for Australian property in the days ahead. So to do a qualified deep dive on the subject, I'm joined again by leading market property analyst Simon Pressley of Propertyology, who is what I actually call a property scientist because he focuses on the future and he looks at the indicators of growth, not past history. He looks at lead indicators, not lagging indicators. In other words, he's learnt to focus on what really matters when it matters most. So welcome and great to have you back, Simon.
Thanks, Bushy. Good to be back in having a chat, mate.
Yeah, love it, mate. Now, you've been in a fair bit of demand lately, and I can understand why. And, we're at a point now where the naysaying doomsday lemon suckers haven't really got a lot of ammunition left to cry about, mate. But let's kick straight off with the US election and get your thoughts, even though it's a little bit early, on what impact, if any, you think it's going to have on property in Australia in the short to medium term.
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, to be honest, I don't think the US election outcome will have one iota of impact on Australian property markets. So I guess at any given time, there's always something major happening in the world somewhere, and that often does have an impact on share markets. Share markets can respond sometimes quite rapidly to sentiment and speculation, but property doesn't respond like that because it's not an index, it's something tangible. It's a piece of bricks and mortar that someone has to want to sell, and there has to be a little bias. I don't think the US election outcome will have any impact at all on Australia.
Yeah, there you go. Great. And a lot of people like to link everything to everything. And some of the correlations are so far left of centre, which I'm going to talk to you a bit more about now, because I think we both have the belief that there's a massive difference between the fiction that a lot of the media commentators like to talk about property and the facts. And a couple of those I wouldn't mind digging into are the myths around migration impact and employment on property values. So I know you've done quite a bit of work on this in recent times, mate. Would you mind illuminating us on your thoughts around that?
Yeah, look, I often describe the property market of an individual town or city, Bushy, as like one big jigsaw puzzle, and there's numerous pieces to the puzzle, and we need to know what those pieces are, where to get them. We need to put them together and then see what the picture looks like. And when the coronavirus first started, and then automatically we knew that the international border would be closed, and Australia always relies so heavily on overseas migration. The people that society put up on a pedestal for property markets, which frankly shouldn't, otherwise known as the economists, well-meaning people and intelligent people, but they're not property market experts, and it was showing up during the coronavirus that they don't understand the complexities of it. They automatically assume that without all this population that we get every year, there's no way that property prices would grow. But the historical evidence, nothing to do with the coronavirus, shows that population growth is one of many, many components that impact property markets. And contrary to what people might believe at a practical level, it's nowhere near the biggest influence of property prices. The other thing that I guess the economists of the world jumped to conclusions on was when there were these forecasts that their unemployment rate would increase from, let's say, 5% to 10%. They automatically determined that there's no way property prices would increase if that did happen. Well, I did okay at mathematics, Bushy, and I think if there's a 10% unemployment rate, it means that 90% are employed, which is still, no one wants to lose jobs, and economies are very important to property markets. But the key thing is are there enough people to have a job and confidence in their jobs to buy property? That's what property markets, that's how it's relevant to property markets, not just the percentage side.
Yeah, and it comes down to the quality of the property too. I mean, as you and I know, not the old saying, oils ain't oils or properties ain't properties. There are good properties that are always going to do well because there's limited supply and high demand. There's those that are the opposite of that, and they're always going to struggle. So while migration and employment might have an impact on the overall economic side of the equation in terms of property values, history tells us that's a pretty different story. But, mate, there's still been a lot of commentators that have been talking about the old fiscal cliff and what that might mean to us when all of the government supports dries up. You're fairly vocal in saying you reckon that's BS. Give us your thoughts on why you think the so-called experts have got their forecasts so grossly wrong, mate.
We've got the trifecta today, haven't we? All the doomsayers. Yeah, look, the fiscal cliff. Look, we've all got different personalities, and our personalities, for most of us, they just are what they are. But a lot of the people who've commented on property markets, their personality is defaulted to the glass half empty rather than the glass half full. The fiscal cliff, it sounds great in a media headline. That's really really why it's used. It creates a lot of drama and creates a lot of tension, but really at the end of the day, there is no fiscal cliff. There will be no fiscal cliff. It is a bullshit term, good for nothing term in my opinion. Look, what they're referring to is things like mortgages being placed on hold. Some consumers have elected to do that when that policy setting was changed in about April. And the purpose of it was to support those whose income had been adversely affected by all these COVID restrictions. So it's a great policy. But of course, the conclusion jumpers, the glass half empty version of the world, said, well, when they stop that support to homeowners, they're automatically going to fall in default, and there's going to be all these foreclosures of properties. So, I mean, that's a very negative mindset. What's important behind the fiscal cliff is understand the spirit of the policy. The spirit is to support. No one benefits, banks, state governments, federal governments, consumers. No one benefits if something happens that unnecessarily forces closures of properties. And so the purpose of this, option to put a pause on your mortgage payment is to ride through this because, let's face it, there's lots of things that we couldn't do there for a couple of months in the whole country. And then more recently in Melbourne, really, lockdown. So the banks will continue to support. They've said that all along. APRA has said that. The RBA has said that. The federal government has said that. So anyone listening to this who is fearful of the fiscal cliff, who's fearful of property prices crashing, please take note of those responsible people who influence that decision, not that fiscal cliff media term. There's actually only... So APRA puts out figures once a month now on this pause on repayments push in. It peaked nationally at 11% of all home loans in Australia back in June. That's how many home loans had the pause button pressed. At the end of September, that had already reduced significantly to 7.5%.
Yep.
And let's not forget that Melbourne did not get out of lockdown until the end of October. And I would suggest that a big portion of that 7.5% of home loans on pause were people living in Melbourne. They'd been locked down for 4 months. So now let's put some perspective around that. Let's say half of the 7.5% were in Melbourne. We're probably talking around about 3% of all home loans in Australia with the pause button pressed on it, meaning 97% it's business as usual. Now, if that's a bloody cliff, Jesus.
Yeah, that certainly don't live anywhere near you or I, mate. And I guess the comfort for me is, and I've often said, mate, of recent times, back in Keating's times in the late 80s, we had the recession that we had to have. This time we've had the recession that we've actually decided to have. And because we've decided to have this recession as a consequence of, the COVID exercise, we've got a government who's absolutely 100% supporting and committed to making sure that the economy is protected. And when you hear the RBA governor say, we will do whatever it takes, and then you look at how strong our financial position is relative to, other parts of the world, we've got pretty deep pockets and we've still got a lot of ammunition left in play to cover any other issues that we may occur along the pathway. And with money as cheap as it's ever been, both for governments and for homeowners, we're in pretty good shape as far as that goes, mate. So, your thoughts on that?
Spot on. Look, I think it's my role to take a very keen interest in economic matters and policy setting for government, that sort of stuff. Let's be honest, the broader Australian public have little to no interest in that. But hopefully, what this coronavirus has done is brought to people's attention why a well-managed economy is so important. Australia entered the coronavirus with a really low level of government debt. We've just returned our budget to surplus, and I think a lot of people, when they kept hearing that stuff for several years, they just showed no interest. They blocked it out. But fortunately, because others who control those things made it their priority to put us in that really good position, when this unprecedented event hit us, we had and still do have an enormous amount of economic arsenal to throw at this thing. And not only have we already got through this, that recession that you said that we forced is already officially over. So the doomsdayers are actually, recession wasn't a dramatic enough word for them. They had to use the word depression, which is actually even bigger. Well, it's actually already over. The recession's gone.
Yeah.
And all the money that has just been recently approved in the latest federal budget, which is thousands of times higher stimulus and infrastructure spending that we've ever spent before. None of it's been spent. It's been announced. It's been approved. But it's been several months, in some cases years, before they actually spend that money, and we're already out of the recession. So we are in boom time. Make no mistake about that.
Absolutely, and I think the COVID's been both a massive wake up call, but it's also been a volume switch because it's brought forward a lot of the infrastructure spend that otherwise would have been spread over a much longer period of time. So as a contrarian, I'm really excited about what this is going to mean to property, and we've got a window of opportunity. There was a lot of people when it hit saying, "Righto, where's the bargains?" Well, it hasn't got any cheaper, but it's going to be the cheapest it's going to be for many years if people don't take advantage of the times that we're now in, because when that confidence and the sentiment comes back, and that will start to occur next year, I think the springback's going to be pretty substantial, mate. But, mate, there's been some, as a result of the wake-up call and as a result of the changes that's had on our collective thinking around property, there are some emerging trends that are likely to impact on property moving forward. Can you share what you think they are?
Yeah, there's some property-specific trends, and there's some trends that we've noticed with consumer spending, which will affect economies, and economies has an indirect impact on the property market. So some property-specific trends. Certainly the high-rise apartments. Australia went through a period roughly from the turn of the century up to and including the start of the coronavirus, where an increasing number of people, for a variety of reasons, wanted to live closer into town and be more central, commute less, be closer to all those cafes, and in a lot of cases they work in town. Well, coronavirus has flipped that on its head. So specific to property, the high-rise apartment that we've always considered a problematic asset class for several years before the coronavirus. I'd suggest anyone contemplating buying an apartment anywhere in Australia, please reconsider. It's in your interest to do that. So we don't want to be cooped up. And those jobs, there were so many of them located in the city of town, in every big city really. A lot of them aren't there now. Some of them might return in time. Some of them will be permanently gone. Another trend we've seen is working from home. For some people, it will just be a short-term fad, and they won't be able to wait until they're allowed to get back to work. For many, it will be something that they have never tried before until the coronavirus, and if they wanted to earn an income for a few months there, the only way they could do that was to find a way to actually and do it from home. So some who have tried it for the first time love it that much, have discovered that they've got somewhere between 10 and 15 hours extra time in their week because they're not commuting. Think about that. 10 to 15 hours per week. You have manufactured more than a day. There's lots of people have done that, like that.
Mate, I'm one of them. I've been doing this for about 5 years now. We've set our operation up so that we can work nationally but work from home. And I couldn't even imagine wanting to jump in a car, train or bus and spend half an hour to an hour travelling to an office in a cold, lonely city, mate. It's not even on the horizon. So I 100% agree with you. And with technology sort of backing us up now, why would you go back to that unless you actually had to, or you don't like spending time with who you're at home with?
Yeah, definitely. We've done it too. I used to, before the coronavirus, used to have 1 day a week that I elected to work from home. It was always my most productive day. I had less interruptions. But during the coronavirus, when we all had no choice other than to work from home, new habits were developed, and we called a team meeting back in June, and the pros far outweighed the cons, and it's become a permanent decision for us. So plenty of people have done that. Some have gone one step further, Bushy. There's already anecdotal evidence based on a big body of research conducted by Propertyology, and they've not only decided to work from home, but when they've made that decision, they question, well, where do they want that home to be? And so they have, in a lot of cases, already sold where they were living and completely left town. And they are going far and wide all over Australia. But what they're doing is it's a combination of reviewing what size mortgage they want. So some people with a big expensive mortgage in, say, Sydney or Melbourne have questioned whether they really want that financial pressure and have relocated and worked from home in a completely different part of Australia. Yeah. Others have brought forward retirement plans. They might still be working, but they might be working now in that location, that idyllic location that they saw themselves retiring in 5, 10, 15 years' time. They're doing that now and enjoying that lifestyle that, as I said, they always want to retire to. So we are seeing this right throughout Australia in a number of real estate patterns.
Mate, I've heard a couple of commentators say, be a bit wary here, this might be a bit of a knee-jerk. Yes, people sort of running for safety and space and security right now, but once COVID's gone, 12 months down the track, we'll have forgotten all about it, and then we'll see things return to what they were. But what's your response when you hear that sort of comment?
Yeah, look, I have heard that, and I guess it's one of those things. It's a subjective thing. It's the thing with opinions, is we've all got them. But often those who say what you've said there, and I've heard them as well, which they're often people that it doesn't suit them to do it, so therefore they wouldn't do it. And that's fine. But what you or I want, we're not, representation of everybody else. We're who we are. So it is a really, really big thing for anyone to relocate from home A to home B, even in the same suburbs. But if someone has relocated to a completely different town, that's not a decision you make on a whim.
No.
There's employment decisions there. There are family and friends to consider. There, complete lifestyles. For some people, there's children to consider. Someone who's made that decision has not made that decision on a whim. That is pursuing something that they really have a strong desire to do. So if they've done it, they've done it. They haven't done it for a short term, we'll come back here in a few months or a couple of years' time. So, make no mistake of that. This is a permanent structural change to Australian real estate.
Yep.
And I have absolutely zero doubt that in the coming years, when the ABS progressively release internal migration data, I have zero doubt that we're going to see big increases in population right throughout regional Australia.
Absolutely no doubt. And interestingly enough, if you draw the parallels with the Spanish flu that occurred back in the late 19 teens, just after or during World War One, exactly the same thing happened. There was a massive decentralisation to regions to avoid the perceived danger of being associated or close to the exercise that had impacts on how we lived and where we lived for decades after that. So I think we're moving into, history repeats in a lot of ways, and we're sort of mirroring that exercise now. So, and I think our pursuit of lifestyle, I mean, that's ultimately what Australians really enjoy, is a great lifestyle. Well, why wouldn't you be doing it in a smaller area with more time on your hands and potentially more space with a lot less financial stress? Makes perfect sense. Are there any other emerging trends that you're seeing that coming out of the current times that we haven't spoken about yet, mate?
I guess the other does relate to work from home. There are an increasing number of employers who are sort of, because it's not just that the employees have been told, sorry, you've got to work from home until further notice. It's also that, the people behind those decisions, the employers, that have been reviewing this as well. Now, we've seen companies such as Telstra, for example, announce, and this is going back as far ago as May and June, so that we've made a decision as a big employer to give all of our workforce the option of where they want to work. We've got offices everywhere, so they can continue to come in if they want. They can work from home if they want. They can relocate, and they can still be connected to us through technology. So banks are reviewing that. Governments are reviewing that. Medium and small businesses have done that. As I said, I've done that. So it's a really big trend, and it's really good for work-life balance. that we talk about a lot, but this is one of the beautiful things that have come out of COVID, I think, is when you take things away from society, it forces you to, it breaks a circuit, really. It forces you to think laterally and to look for different alternatives and to prioritise things. And doing that, some people have actually found something that they're grateful for.
And it's habit forming. We're actually changing habits, and once you start to change habits are not easy to break. So I think the real challenge, and you've touched on it earlier on, you talked about apartments, and I've never been a fan of apartments because there's no land value in it anyway. But I think some of those areas close to the cities that now aren't so reliant on having to go to the commercial HQ in the CBD, but potentially going to have some fun and games. So I think there'll be winners and losers in this to some degree. Certainly those lifestyle areas that have the technology support that allow people to work from home and everything else that goes with it are clearly going to be the winners. But mate, I've always said that property is a bit of a game of finance, and we've seen another rate drop. Well, at least the RBA dropped the cash rate, and the banks have sort of only half gone that way by sort of throwing out fixed rate reductions without mucking around with the variable side of the equation. But did you think that's likely to have much impact in conjunction with the, more importantly probably, the lending law relaxation that may well occur in March next year once the responsibility shifts from the banks to the borrowers? How do you see that impacting on property as we move forward?
Enormous, absolutely enormous. But I guess it's an extension of something that actually started, I don't reckon it's a coincidence, directly after last year's federal election in May.
Yep.
We had an instance, we had a few things happen there. The election itself meant that negative gearing was safe. And within literally weeks, we had APRA come out and put their hand up and say, we went too hard with this tight credit policy that was in place for about 3 years and just kept getting tighter and tighter. So they started to relax things back in May, June, and the RBA started their series of rate cuts back then. So even before the coronavirus, the availability of credit progressively was becoming much better than what it had been for several years. Still bloody, mountain of paperwork that people have got to rustle up. I don't think that we'll see that cease, but what we have already seen it is more common sense used by those assessing these credit applications for people. And the announcement that you're talking about, the government decision in March next year, which is will actually take a lot of fear away from the banks. At the moment, there's a lot of loans that they want to approve, but they're worried about getting in trouble after the event for being accused of it being a reckless decision and being sued because of that. So the March slated decision will mean responsibility comes back to borrowers. So they're treating borrowers like adults, as they bloody should, like they used to. And why I think this is going to be huge, about 12 months ago I released the top 10 things that influence property markets at a macro level. And number one was credit supply. We go back through the history of Australian real estate and we look at periods when we had our big booms and we look at periods when markets were very subdued. And there's no coincidence that like the biggest boom that Australian real estate's ever had, it was from the year 2001 to 2004. And credit was readily available back then, and it's actually possible to get a 100% home loan. We shouldn't go back to those days, but it does prove the point that if credit is readily available, more people can transact in property, and it works in reverse. If you tighten things up, before someone buys the asset, almost everybody must buy the debt first. You need to make it available to people.
Yeah, 100%. It's really the oxygen that fuels the whole industry as far as that goes. And our breaking arm, I'll be honest, we're still seeing it. A lot of the credit assessors are still thinking under the old regime. So, refinances are taking up to 3 months to go through because of the hoops that need to be jumped through. And it's going to take a while again to break those internal habits. The policy might change, but the people need to implement it. So, but the good news is that it is going to free up. And as you well point out, it's the flow of credit that really funds capacity, but also demand. So it's pretty exciting times in terms of the impact that's likely to have on properties, particularly strong demand properties.
Yeah, and look, what I find interesting, just talking more so about credit than finance, not just now. I found this interesting for years. As you're probably aware, Bushy, my background in a former life is banking and finance.
Yeah.
And I remember the old days pushing a pen approving loans. We didn't have technology. There's no such thing as laptops and websites and all the wonderful gadgets we've got today. But yet we would approve a loan within hours. Yeah. And fast forward now with all this technology, with a lot more resources available at our disposal, and you just said taking up to 3 months to approve something. I mean, it's not like loans are new. We've had loans since Captain Cook bloody arrived here. And yet it's taking us, weeks and weeks longer to do the same job. It doesn't make sense, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think the recent Supreme Court case where Westpac were taking to the case, and they're calling it the Wagyu and Shiraz case, where the judge actually said, "Well, look, just because I have Wagyu and steak today doesn't mean I'm going to spend that money on that if I've got a home loan. We've got to respect that borrowers are actually smart enough and have got enough common sense to adjust their spending to suit what their commitments are." And I think that shift, that simple shift there, and that the roll on, and I wonder whether the Treasurer might have been trying to get a home loan recently, mate, and he suddenly realised how log-jammed the whole process is, and now wants to inject some common sense back into it, knowing that our road to returning to good days is if all Australians continue to spend, not overspend, but continue to spend, because if we hide it under the bed, then we end up with where they were at back in the 1930s. So I think what's positive there is that the government recognises that they're trying to make it easy for us to continue to invest in our future. So and
just for the listeners, make no mistake, we're not talking about recklessly lending loans. That's to the contrary. Like, banks will continue to be responsible, and they'll continue to be supervised to make sure that they do that. But what we're talking about doing is treating adults like adults. A good example there with the Wagyu and the Shiraz, like. Someone going on an overseas holiday last year. Well, it doesn't mean they're going to do that next year with a higher mortgage. And the individual borrower, it's their credit rating. So they will want to protect that. It's their assets. It's their deposit money. They will want to protect that. So if they don't protect that, well, they'll be the ones who will pay in future when they go to get financing in the tracks.
Totally agree, mate. So that provides a great segue into the fuel it is going to put into the property generally. Sort of starting to drill in a little bit. What sort of locations do you think are going to experience rising prices, and on the flip side, those that may be seeing falls?
Yeah, well, it's much easier to list off the vulnerable markets than it is the rising markets, which is not fair to say that. But the vulnerable markets, and we said this actually before COVID started, our 2020 property market outlook, which we released on New Year's Eve. And at that stage, if you said the coronavirus to me, Bushy, I would have thought you were using some new swear word I never heard of before. But back then, we described Sydney and Melbourne as having the weakest fundamentals of our capital city markets. We said that a number of capital cities, their fundamentals were as good as they've been for a decade or more. And we said that large parts of regional Australia had a particularly exciting outlook. Now, that was nothing to do with coronavirus.
Yeah.
Now we layer in the coronavirus impact on those existing fundamentals, and Sydney and Melbourne have become even more vulnerable. Why that is, their economies are more reliant on international, whether it's students, whether it's tourism, whether it's overseas migration. If the germ itself, it spreads and breeds in congestion, so they're the two most densely populated cities. So Sydney and Melbourne will be our most vulnerable markets for quite some time. We're particularly concerned about Melbourne because its economy was locked up for months. Outside of that, almost all of Australia, you have a really, really exciting time ahead. There are actually many markets in Australia that are booming now, and I mean seriously booming. I'm just going to go from memory here. I'll start in Western Australia first. Karratha is a mining story, obviously, but it's grown by about 40% over the last 3 years. In South Australia, Mount Barker is going absolutely Mount Gambier, is going absolutely crazy at the moment. That's an agriculture and a tourism story and a flight away from congestion. Whyalla is expanding significantly. That's a manufacturing story and an urban renewal story. All of Tasmania is on fire at the moment. Their property markets are going crazy. Launceston is arguably the hottest market in Australia. Hobart, a bit of a pause button for a few months, and now it's really ratcheted back up, and Burnie's also strong. New South Wales, it's Orange is going crazy, double-digit price growth in Orange, and it's most of the coastal locations north of about Port Macquarie. So I'm referring to Byron Bay, Ballina, Coffs Harbour, Tweed Head, all those markets double-digit pace right now.
Yep.
Victoria, Bendigo, cannot rent a property. You'll struggle to buy a property. Internal migration is huge. Stock on market, there's bugger all there. Double-digit price growth. Beautiful part of the world to live in.
Yep.
But Warrnambool's also strong. Mildura's very strong in Victoria. Queensland, much of the state. Townsville is showing some, or started to grow before COVID, and is quite strong right now. Cairns, we had some question marks over when COVID hit. Pleased to say it's held up firm and prices are growing. Hervey Bay is solid. Noosa is right up there. Talking to agents there recently, and he reckons he's seen prices grow by about 25% just this calendar year. Crazy stuff.
Interesting.
All the Sunshine Coast is strong. Gold Coast had a few problematic months, but it seems to have settled down quite nicely. So, and there's probably more. I've just rattled those off my head, and there's probably 20 locations that I've described as, if not booming now, are well on the way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's pretty exciting times. Which sort of buyer demographics are most active in those locations, mate?
Right throughout Australia, Bushy, the data and the anecdotal evidence when we talk to agents, what's happening on the ground, first home buyers are really strong, and that's a great success story. It's wonderful. Young people are taking advantage of. I don't think there's been better conditions for them, to be honest. Certainly there's never been lower interest rates in Australian history. So, jumping on that first home buyer deposit scheme, the federal government scheme that was announced pre-COVID, and it's still there now. Some are taking advantage of that. Others are taking advantage of new build, because there's a few incentives there and initiatives. So first home buyers are really strong. Existing homeowners who are upgrading, and that's really probably a byproduct of I think we've had now 6 or 7 interest rate drops since the federal election.
Yeah.
So some people have sort of gone, geez, my minimum monthly mortgage payment is hundreds and hundreds of dollars less than what it now than what it was, and either doing a renovation or selling the one they're in and buying somewhere nicer.
Yep.
And some of them going that one step further. If you're talking earlier about the work from home thing, and that somewhere nicer is a completely different town. So that's really strong. Not a lot of investor activity. Investors are creatures of habit, though. They tend to need to see evidence of markets moving. We know it's moving because we're buying property for investors there. But the broader data that investors look to see, they're probably not going to see that until the new year. And when they do, they'll be like, wow, where did that come?
Yeah.
But they're the main demographic. And there's some expats. Whilst we've got no overseas migration at the minute, we do have Australians returning home, and some of them are just sort of saying, well, I'm back for good now, and they're buying.
Well, I heard some anecdotal stuff the other day. I mean, they're bringing 4,000 a week back into the country. Well, you do the maths on that. That's the same number of immigrants that were coming in. And there's a lot that are, from my hometown in Adelaide. I talked to someone the other day that was saying there's, in excess of 80,000 people trying to get back into South Australia who, there's a lot of people that left South Australia to go to the eastern states for work. And with that shift that you've spoken about in terms of decentralising, allowing people to work from home, then a lot are actually coming home because of the family support, still got the jobs, they can still do it, but they're doing it from there. Just some awesome stories about where that's going to go to. So you sort of covered this a little bit, but locations where supply is tight, any further information around that than what we've already spoken about?
Yeah, so I guess we measure supply in a few, three key areas. One, the rental supply, which is vacancy rate. For those when you hear that term, it's a measure of rental supply. We measure new construction, so that's the volume of extra dwellings that are going to hit the market, and we measure what we call resale supply. It's an existing property owned somewhere that's up for sale. All those metrics throughout most of Australia are tight. Melbourne, we are seeing a pretty rapid increase in the volume of properties listed for sale, which is one of the reasons why we're concerned. We think that some people during the Melbourne lockdown made their decision to relocate, partly through fear of it happening again, or part of it might be job related. They might have lost their jobs in the lockdown and they've already made plans to move somewhere else. So Melbourne's resale supply is tight. Rental supply, there are 3% vacancy rate is the sort of the equilibrium. Anything above 3% we technically call an oversupply rental market.
Yeah.
Of all of Australia, of which there are obviously the 8 capital cities, and let's call it 200 regional towns and cities, there are only 3 that are oversupplied, and they are Sydney, Melbourne, and the Gold Coast. Geelong, for a few months, was in that oversupply bracket as well, but is now under that. Maybe some people have relocated from Melbourne to Geelong the last couple of months, not too sure. But most of Australia is exceptionally tight. There is enormous pressure on rents, which is going to push some tenants into the first home buyer bracket and put extra pressure on property prices. But also that pressure on rents is great for investors, strong yields and rising incomes.
Yeah, it's a very good story, and it leads beautifully into your prediction that 2021 is in for a big boom and the biggest that we've seen in over 15 years. You've talked a lot about why, but if you summarise that, let's pull that together. Why do you think we're in for a boom in the very near future?
Yeah, well, I guess before I answer that, either I'm going to look like an idiot in a couple of years' time, or those lemon suckers will, because they're the ones who forecast somewhere between 20 and 50% price decline. Well, I reckon in the 2021 calendar year, all things being equal, with COVID still being with us, but I think the longer it's with us, the more, as a society, we become accustomed to what we need to do and how we can cope with it. So, all things being equal, I reckon by the time data is produced for the 2021 calendar year, there will be a reasonable list of locations that experience not just double-digit growth. I'm going to double down and say there will be locations that probably had up to 20% price growth in a single calendar year. Yeah. That's how strong the fundamentals are in large parts of Australia. We've got tight supply from a resale point of view, from a rental point of view, and our construction industry hasn't been approving anywhere near as many dwellings over the last few years before COVID as what they ordinarily will. So supply is certainly not going to cause a downturn, I can promise you that. Yeah. Our economies, large parts of Australia haven't had a single case of COVID for many, many months. Not a single case for many, many months.
Yeah.
There's some industries that are doing particularly well. A lot of government spending, so our government departments are expanding their workforces. Agriculture has been strong in Australia for a few years, but we let's not forget we had a drought this time last year. Yeah. So we've got strong water supply, and the really strong demand that's been there for a long time for our agri sector. Now they can capitalise on it, so that's really strong. Food manufacturing is going crazy. And manufacturing in general, one thing that COVID is going to do is it's going to bring back Australia, from 100 years ago, that we were renowned for making stuff. But progressively, we've put a lot of that stuff offshore, made offshore. I think there's going to be a lot more made here. Our defence force is expanding both from a personnel point of view, but also manufacturing their entire fleet. All the ships and the submarines and the helicopters and the fighter jets, they're being manufactured in factories all around Australia, creating lots of jobs. Renewable energy projects like you would not believe, creating lots of jobs. Domestic tourism is going crazy. I know for a fact that a lot of entire towns, you can't book a restaurant through the new year. You can't get any Airbnb accommodation through the new year. So it is a really, really healthy outlook from an economic point of view. And this is before the stimulus stuff that they said earlier, Bushy, that ScoMo announced in the recent budget. So that's what's going to drive property prices.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that's lagging at the moment, because people are still glued to the lemon suckers that dominate the mainstream media, is the confidence and the sentiment. And as you and I both know, that does have an influence. And with all this good news coming through, and it can't help but start to filter through to the average Joe, then that's when we're going to see an unleashed rebound that will help drive it. Because while all the fundamentals are there, there's still that nervousness of people just sort of quietly sitting on the sidelines. That's becoming very compelling now as it moves forward. So if we add that together with the better access to and free flowing credit, then 2021 is looking like a very strong year in property. So
yeah, and I think the confidence is probably, there's a bit of a split there. It depends whether you're the consumer who consumes a lot of stuff on your iPhone and TV. If you do that, you'll be still reading a lot of doom and gloom, because those people are wired that way, and eventually they won't be able to stop talking like that because there'll be enough evidence to make them look like idiots. But if you're out and about, if you're enjoying a holiday, if you're weekend options and open homes, you will see with your very eyes, you will see a lot of confidence. We caught up with some friends yesterday, and they got back. This is late yesterday afternoon, and they just got back from JB Hi-Fi, and they said the shopping centre was absolutely jam-packed. You want a measurement of confidence? There it is there in the retail sector. Yeah. So if you get out and about, you will see that it's not doom and gloom. In fact, it's probably as confident as Australia has been for several years. But if you're consuming digital media, that will play with your head for sure.
And there's a hint. Stop doing it. It's my advice. I've been using the newspaper to wrap the chips and light the fire for years, mate, and that's about it all it's been good for. And I have a similar view of the mainstream. So you get your information where the information counts, and that's talking to the likes of yourself, Simon. But, mate, if you were someone, just to close and bring this all to a head then, if you had someone who had, between 100 and 200 grand in either savings or equity sitting in a property, and you thought that now is a good time to start investing for the long term, what would you do, where and why?
First, I'd say 200 grand is a nice figure to be excited about. Some basic investment principles. If that's my $200,000, I don't believe in putting it all on black. We've all heard that saying, don't have all your eggs in one basket. Property investors, unfortunately, do it all too often without thinking of it. So do not put your $200,000 into one property asset, would be my first bit of general counsel. I'd break it up, and you're pleasantly surprised that if that's two $100,000 deposits, that's effectively going to be two investment properties, round figures, $450,000, something like that. Yeah. In this climate, with record low interest rates and remaining that way for many, many years, maybe all our life, your rental income will cover 100% of your annual investment expenses. So you've got two properties. I would buy those two affordable properties. I would look outside of your hometown. Why I say that, again, putting all your eggs in the one basket. Everyone's heard that saying and understands why it makes sense. So too many property investors live in a city and then buy an investment property in the same city. You have to put all your eggs in one basket. So take advantage of all of Australia. I've just described to you, and I say this deliberately really strongly, the biggest boom this country has seen since our most prosperous era in our history, which was 2001 to 2005. You have $200,000 now. You have an opportunity to take advantage of that. Remove the blinkers and look far and wide, and you will be wonderfully surprised at how strong markets are.
Yeah, great prophetic words to finish on, mate. Always love your insights. I love the data that you drill into and the work you do on stuff that really matters. In terms of what's going to happen with property. Yes, looking in the rear vision mirror tells us what's happened, but that's only part of the story. Mate, very thankful for you being generous again today to spend some time with us, and looking forward to getting you on a regular basis to do exactly the same. Thanks, Simon.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Woody.
Thanks, mate. Much. Good on you, mate. Talk to you again soon. Cheers. Well, freedom fighters, how good was that? To get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello@khgroup.com.au. That's hello@khgroup.com.au. Or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au/get invested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening, and as always, dream as if you'll live forever and live as if you'll die